I don't hear any sound yet. Do you have a cable that I can put into the mixing desk?
Yeah. Where is this one? Yes. Ah, ok. Hop. Il va mettre son jack direct.
Thank you. All right, we're gonna try. No, it's probably gonna need to have the gain brought up somewhere. Do you know where that comes in?
Quelqu'un sait faire marcher ce temps-là. Tout est allumé.
We're just going to do it this way. The quality of the sound is not important enough, so... Oh, can you?
You think you will have to come in this one?
Again? Yay, all right. Wonderful, thank you.
So Andrew McPherson doing the latency interaction bandwidth and why they matter. Industry talk. Thank you for you and for your patience.
Great, okay, so apologies, we're getting rather a late start. I will try to go a bit less than 30 minutes so we can catch up a little bit. But delighted to be here, first in-person conference since 2019. I know a lot of you are in the same boat, so yeah, and thank you to all the organizers for making this happen. It's fantastic. So my name's Andrew McPherson, and I am here on behalf of a team of 5 people whose names you see here, including Robert Jack, who is also here at SMC, and 3 developers of Bella, Julio, Astrid, and Adan, who are not here, but available online should you have any questions for them. Now, I wear 2 different hats here. One is at Queen Mary University of London, where I'm a professor, and I run a lab called the Augmented Instruments Laboratory. And then we also have a company, Augmented Instruments Limited, which for the last 6 years has been responsible for the development and maintenance and kind of community formation of Bella as a platform. So on that note, what am I talking about here with Bella? Well, you're welcome to come to our booth, which is just right outside near the front of the conference hall. But basically, Bella is a single board computer designed specifically for the needs of people doing real-time audio and sensor systems. For example, building musical instruments, doing audio processing, building other kinds of live interactive systems. And it consists of a few different things. As I said, it's an embedded computer designed with audio in mind. That means that we are interested in the resources that you would get from a Linux single board computer, but we also prioritize connectivity of the sort that you would get on a microcontroller, the ability to hook up sensors of various sorts and actuators. And the entire thing is optimized for processing signals in real time. In fact, we take a very specific approach to signal processing on Bella. And the essential idea is, I would describe it as sensors as audio. Basically, the idea that every sensor, analog or digital, that you hook up to the board can be treated as if it were an audio signal sampled at audio rates with very high timing precision and extremely low latency. And that last point is one that is going to be the focus of this talk. Finally, Bella as a platform is entirely open hardware, open source software. You can find all the plans on our GitHub repository, and we've got a whole series of community resources, which I will come back to in a little bit. So this is the team. It's 5 of us currently involved in the development of Bella. We launched this project on Kickstarter in 2016 and spun it out into a company later on that year. And we've got a really vibrant community of people working across industry, academia, independent artists, and so forth. And we've been really pleased with basically the response that we've gotten, and we've thankfully had an opportunity to grow recently. So we are now partnering up with the team at Chair Audio, Max and Clemens, who are here at the conference this week, and also have a paper. There they are. Hello. So we're delighted that you are joining us in the development of the next generation of Bella. So fantastic. So this is who we are. Now, let's put Bella to the side for a minute and just talk about the context that all of this stuff is happening in. what I'm interested in my research and in my practice is real-time audio, especially for digital musical instruments, but more broadly, any kind of real-time audio processing systems. Could be effects, for instance. And I really like this quote from Bill Buxton, who is a pioneer in human-computer interaction, talking about the 3 levels of design. You have your standard spec, you have your military spec, and you have your artist spec. And that the last of those is the hardest and the most important. But of course, if you can nail it, then everything else is easy. This is not to say that we are covertly doing weapons research in our lab, but there is a point here. I think there's a really serious point behind this quote, and that has to do with the kinds of things that a player expects out of their musical instrument. If you think about what a violinist would expect from their instrument, I mean, the degree of spatial and temporal precision the instrument has to exhibit is just astonishing. And it's a very high-dimensional interaction, a lot of which is incredibly nonlinear, which makes our jobs as programmers and mathematical modelers very difficult. It's a multimodal experience, and then if that wasn't hard enough, then it needs to be absolutely 100% reliable for somebody to be willing to take it onto the stage. And if that wasn't enough, then you also have to add this entire extra layer of cultural expectations, acquired sensory motor skills, and you can start to see why designing a digital musical instrument is actually not trivial at all. It's an incredibly hard challenge to do this well. Now, what I want to focus on in this talk initially is this issue here, latency. And this is a thing that probably many of you are familiar with already, but there's some subtleties to this issue, and I just want to outline what they are and why they're so incredibly important. So for those not familiar, latency basically means delay. We're talking about the delay between action and reaction, which is a fundamental property of any digital system. So for example, suppose I built something that read in a sensor signal and produced a sound in response. You might see something that looked a bit like this. And the latency is defined as the delay between the stimulus and the response, typically measured in some number of milliseconds in the contexts that we're interested in. Now, where does this come from? Where does this latency come from? There's actually quite a number of different places, and it's worth unpacking them because to understand each one tells you how you can make more responsive systems, and that's ultimately what I want to communicate here. This block diagram is showing you a round-trip audio processing system. This could be an audio plug-in, for example. Audio in, audio out, running on a computer, and you have some sort of code that is running. And there's 3 primary sources of delay. The first of them is the delay inherent in the analog to digital and digital to analog conversion itself. And this is an absolutely fundamental part of the chips that are doing this conversion. It's not something that you can fix with software settings, although sometimes you can make it better by working with different audio sample rates. This might be up to about 1 millisecond round trip, depending on what parts you're using. However, one of the bigger sources of latency that you encounter, especially on general purpose computers, is buffering inside the operating system itself. And we're going to come back to the reasons for this in a minute. But this depends on the system block size, which is something that's adjustable in your software. This could potentially contribute tens of milliseconds of latency. And then finally, we have to remember that latency is a property of a complete system and not just of a platform. The code that you write might itself have to have its own latency. This isn't necessarily how computationally complex it is to operate. It has more to do with the kinds of signal processing operations that are in place, and we'll come back to this as well. So I want to start here, though, in the middle, because this is, in many situations, the most significant source of latency. And what is going on here? Well, the fundamental problem is that computers do lots of things all at the same time. Your computer runs dozens of programs and dozens more that you don't even see behind the scenes. The same is true of your phone. They are not single-function devices, and therefore, it's not reasonable to expect that every time a new audio sample comes in, the computer drops everything instantaneously and the next nanosecond goes and runs your audio code. As a result, you have to deal with this kind of timing uncertainty of when your code is allowed to run at all, and the usual response to this, as many of you will be familiar, is that our computer audio systems process audio in blocks rather than one sample at a time. That way your code runs less often and does more at a time, and you can handle a certain amount of timing uncertainty. And your block sizes could be anywhere from maybe 32 samples up to 512 or more, depending on what your operating system context is. The result is this. Basically, you have a little kind of assembly line operation going on here, where your code is always busy calculating just one step ahead of what the audio hardware is playing. So while the audio hardware is busy playing the last block, your code is busy calculating the next one. And the idea of staying in real time is basically just not falling off the treadmill. You just have to keep running and make sure that you stay ahead of what the audio hardware needs to play. And again, each of these blocks would be something that would involve, you know, some number of audio samples, some power of 2 typically. Let me illustrate this in a little bit more detail in a round trip situation. Let's say that we have some audio input coming in. This is our guitar effect example. We are going to gather a block of audio input samples. When they come in from the hardware, we're going to package them up in a little buffer, and we're going to pass them over to the audio code, where the CPU is going to process them and do whatever effect it is that we've written. And that while that's happening, meanwhile, the hardware is busy gathering the next block. Now, when we're done with our processing, we're going to take the result and we're going to play it out the audio output. And so you can see that what's happening is that at any given time, there are 3 things happening in parallel: gathering the input, doing the processing, playing the output. Now, the important implication of this is that if you follow the pipeline from beginning to end, you can see that there is always, no matter what, a latency of twice the buffer length. So if the buffer size was 512 samples, there is 1,024 samples of latency from beginning to end, even if your code does nothing at all. And this is just inherent in how the audio system works. And it just goes on like this. So basically, the trick to minimizing this is really simple. You have to keep the buffer size as small as possible. And that's very easy to say, and it's very difficult to do for some reasons that we'll see in a minute. I'm also going to come back to this issue of group delay and audio processing latency in just a moment. I want to highlight one more scenario, though, that comes up a lot. And for those of you building interactive systems, you might have a situation where you have a sensor board, like an Arduino or a Teensy or something, and that this is connected to your computer by a USB cable. Your sensor board is gathering data, it's streaming it across the USB link, and then you have something like Max or PD running on the computer producing sound. We have actually 4 sources of latency here. First, we have the latency associated with sampling the sensors themselves, and especially if your sample rate is very low, then you basically have kind of 1 frame worth of latency just in that conversion process. Then you have the latency of communicating between the sensor board and the computer at a hardware level, and for some really unknown reason, at least it was true a few years ago, that all the Arduino examples communicate over serial at 9600 BPS. I mean, that hasn't been a current standard since about 1985, and yet here we are, and communicating at just an absolute snail's pace. And what it means is that every byte that you send takes a millisecond. We don't have to have it work that way right now, but you just have to be aware that there are consequences to low communication rates. We end up with a different set of problems once the data ends up in the computer. And here we have operating system drivers, which are not necessarily optimized for low latency. They're optimized not to lose any data. And so you might have it that most of your packets are really quick to respond, except for that one that just mysteriously takes 100 milliseconds. So this can be a little bit of a problem. And then, of course, you have at least half of the audio processing latency chain on top of all of that. So the other problem that this introduces is not just an absolute amount of latency, but a variation in it, and we call this jitter. This is the kind of the random variation in reaction times. And you can think about it this way. Suppose that we're processing audio in blocks like this, and suppose that we are receiving triggers from the outside world. Somebody hits a drum pad or presses a button. Now, there's no reason to believe that those triggers are going to happen only at the intervals of the block size, right? They could happen anytime. They could happen anytime in the middle of a block. But if that data is being collected on a different thread than your audio code, the problem is you might not know exactly when that came in. All you can do is say it came in sometime during this block, and the best you can do is respond at the beginning of the next block. So the problem that you have is that if you look at the delay from the red arrow to the blue response, it varies randomly from one stimulus to the next. This is the jitter, and it degrades the experience of an instrument. the larger the block size, of course, the greater the potential for jitter. Right. So, okay, does any of this matter? This is a fine, kind of technical lecture, blah, blah, blah. Yes, unequivocally, this matters enormously. And it matters even when you don't hear an audible delay between action and reaction. Okay, so how good is good enough? How low is low enough? Here, like in so many things, we turn to the wisdom of David Wessel, who wrote back in 2002 that we should put a cap on the acceptable latency at 10 milliseconds with no more than 1 millisecond of jitter. I found out later, I think from Adrian Fried, that they did some experiments at IRCAM, maybe in the 80s or 90s, that led to this, but I don't think the experiments behind this were ever published. That's just the recommendation, which has been with us. But we actually tried to do our own experiments just to find out whether this was true or not. And here, this is for the PhD work of Robert Jack, again, one of the Bella team. And he built this basic digital percussion instrument, and just some tiles which produce a sound in response to a strike. The key feature was that the native instrument itself had extremely low latency, less than a millisecond, so that we could artificially add it, just to test what the response of players would be. And we did a double-blind experiment with both professional percussionists and with amateur musicians who were not professionals, and analyzed a number of different things. And I'll just give you the headline results here. First, let's have a little listen to what it does. Paper if you want to find out kind of the full experimental details, but the headline result is this. When we asked people to compare pairs of instruments, one of these test conditions against the reference condition with no latency, we found that if we gave them 10 milliseconds of latency that was absolutely constant, they rated it basically indistinguishable from the reference. You give them 20 milliseconds of latency, the experience degrades noticeably. And if you give them 10 milliseconds of latency with 3 milliseconds of jitter, even though the average latency is the same, the experience degrades enormously. And this last point is super interesting because if you look at the timing accuracy of how people were playing against a beat, nobody is 3 milliseconds accurate, not even the professionals. But there's something in that response that just that little bit of sloppiness around the outside really just makes you feel disconnected from the instrument. So it seems that David Wessel was right. 10 milliseconds seems to be good enough. I don't know where the threshold is, if it's 12 or 13 or 19, but it matters. We have to keep this latency as low as possible. Given that, how do we stand in the field? Well, it depends what tools you use. Here's an example of using an Arduino board as a sensor processing device connected to Max MSP, but insert any sensor board and insert any software and you'll get something similar. What you find is that it is very difficult in this kind of sensor board plus computer with USB link to get either under 10 milliseconds or low jitter. And it's just for all the reasons that I identified before. You usually do the best when you're working with USB MIDI, typically because MIDI is actually optimized in the operating system for latency, whereas serial is not. Anyway, there's more details on that in this paper. And so you can see here's our magic threshold, and so many of the conditions that we tested were well above that. Now, I'll just go through this briefly, but basically we also noticed that in this kind of experimental setup there was a significant amount of jitter, and it manifested at intervals of the audio block size. So what would happen is a trigger would sometimes land, maybe 3 blocks later, sometimes 4 blocks later, and so you would end up with this really kind of these discrete kind of bins that your latency would fall into. Then this surely can't be good for responsive musical instruments. Right, okay, so back to Bella then for a second. Why are we so obsessed with this, and what is it that we can do instead? Well, so first of all, what the Bella board does is it gives you audio input and output, it gives you a series of analog and digital inputs and outputs, and some other stuff. We don't need to go into it in a massive amount of detail. We've got a miniature version of it, same processor. It's a 1 gigahertz ARM Cortex A8 processor running Linux. and again, sensors and audio connected to the board. Now, the reason that we can do better on Bella has to do with our hardware and our software architecture. Audio is being collected from an audio codec specifically designed for the purpose. We have a couple chips doing analog to digital, digital to analog conversion. We could use Linux to do all of these things, to give us the drivers, but we don't. And the reason that we don't do that is that Linux is too slow. The Linux kernel cannot respond fast enough to be able to get a low enough audio buffer size that we can get a low latency. And so here's what we do instead. We're using a real-time extension to the Linux kernel called Xenimi. Xenimi basically lets you run certain processes as if they are running bare metal on the board without any operating system at all. So you can basically guarantee that some process that you run is going to always be the highest priority thing that the hardware does. And what's great about this is that it really reduces the uncertainty in the response time to your audio. And it lets us get our audio block size right down to as small as 2 samples, which basically means that almost all of that buffering latency is gone and you're just left with the other elements. We started late, so I'm not going to get into that for right now. But basically, we have some assists from some microcontrollers on the board, which let us parcel up our audio and our sensors in a time-aligned, frame-by-frame, synchronous kind of way. The result of which is effectively this idea I said earlier, sensors as audio. Every analog, every digital channel could equally well be an audio signal, and you can count on the time alignment between them. And the result is that you can basically get very high bandwidth, very subtle control of your sound processes. And basically, here's the result. There's our 10 millisecond threshold, and you can see that basically all conditions are well below it. I was going to say a few more things about Bella. I don't want to spend too long on this because I don't want to take too much time, but suffice it to say we've tried to make this accessible as well. So we have a browser-based IDE with an oscilloscope, support a large number of programming languages, including Faust, PD, SuperCollider, C-Sound, and a lot of open source hardware and software resources. I think what I'll say is if you want to learn more about this, come find us at our booth later on, and we'd be delighted to tell you about these things. I've done a free YouTube course on C++ audio programming if anyone is interested in that sort of thing. Again, come chat with us afterwards. In the very last bit of this talk, I want to come back then not just to the question of latency, but also to this question of richness of interaction. And here's a quote I like, kind of in the area of embodied music cognition. The idea that the instrument becomes an extension of the musician, and that it kind of disappears from conscious attention so that you can focus on the actions of making music. And what is it ultimately that's going to yield this kind of effect? Well, I've observed something in our field that I think is both promising and frustrating in equal measure. And the observation is that we have these amazing physical models out there of instruments now. Some of which are being presented here this very week, some of which are out there in commercial practice as well. You can make a great model of a guitar or a violin or a piano, and you can control it from various physical parameters. It might be really expensive, but that's okay. You can put it on a GPU. You might even be able to run it in real time. And in principle, you've done something really, you've solved a lot of problems. And yet, what do you do about the interface between the player's fingers and the strings or the bow? How do we capture that level of detail, that level of richness? We don't really have a good answer for this yet. And as a result, we oftentimes get models like these played by interfaces like this. And it's like a wonderful magical world inside of a sealed glass bottle. It's just very disappointing in some ways. So I guess my observation is that a key challenge that we face is not just making better sound models, but having a better integration between hardware and the physical, the digital and the physical worlds. We set out to test this in an instrument that we built called Strummy, and this is available as a demo out on the booth. And basically, in a nutshell, we were interested in a number of things, but probably the central thing was, does a greater richness of control produce a better response from performers? So we have 2 different settings that I'll show you here. One of them basically just uses the strings as triggers. So you pop them and it fires off a sound. The other one takes the sound from these piezo elements and feeds it directly into a compass code. This to 16 guitarists and 16 non-musicians and basically asked them which of these two settings do you prefer. And the guitarists were really unanimous. We prefer the richer model. You know, we didn't tell them what was what, but they preferred the one that was the continuous audio interaction. But I thought it was interesting that the non-musicians were actually really split, and that, you know, a lot of the non-musicians would say things like, well, this other one was nicer to play because you didn't have to work so hard, or because you always got a nice sound. This relates to a quality that David Wessel called control intimacy. And what we observe is a kind of relationship between expertise and control intimacy, where what experts and novices want might be slightly different. And so there's a possible future direction here of kind of tailoring the richness of instruments to the ability of the performers. Now, I think I'm not gonna go through all the rest of this. This is a project of a kind of a hybrid acoustic electric violin. Come talk to me afterwards, I'd be delighted to talk to you about it. But the last point that I would make around richness and latency is just, this is about more than platforms. This is also about the algorithms that we write and the way that we design our models. So you might say, well, look, my system has audio in and audio out. Maybe I don't have these problems of richness. Or I might say, well, you know, I'm using a Bellabor and I don't have any latency or jitter problems. Well, sorry to say, life isn't that simple. And basically, it has to do with the nature of a block-based process, which I think I'm just gonna have to leave this as a kind of thing to talk about later on, because I want us to get back towards schedule. But suffice to say that especially when you're doing things with FFTs, you're doing spectral audio processing, you have a situation where you have lots of overlapping blocks of samples that you do stuff on. And what you'd kind of like to do is basically just have everything transferred from input to output exactly in place. But we can't do that because the system isn't causal, because it means that outputs depend on inputs that happen in the future. So at minimum, we have to add one window of latency to any system involving block-based processing. But even that's not good enough, because if you do only one window's worth of latency, then you have essentially one sample in which to do all your computations. So net result is that you end up with one window plus one hop of latency just to do any kind of process involving blocks like FFTs or autocorrelations or whatever. And this is something that will actually really catch us out in a lot of deep learning models as well, if they're using spectral features, for example. So I think I could say more, but I'm going to stop there and just leave this up and say, if you'd like to talk to us more, we're outside. You can find us on social media at Bella Platform. Check out the Bella blog. We've got projects there and some resources online. And yeah, if you're interested in Bella stuff, we've also got some little discount codes and other stuff. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your patience with the tech issues. And yeah, see you.
So thank you. Now we switch to the second paper session. And Raphael Forman and Alex McLean for the first presentation. How live is live coding the course of tidal longest light?
Here, you might want the audio.
right. Hi, everyone. Hi. Good to meet you. My name is Raphael Formand here, and I co-wrote an article with Alex McLean that some of you might know. He's a well-known live coder. So, the article is with a provocative name, All Live is Live Coding. Is live coding even live? And yeah, so the idea behind this article is to have a discussion with Alex with our different backgrounds and try to see, by observing an event I will describe, the longest night, like what is the whole spectrum of live coding practices and what we can learn about it. So I'm doing my PhD in musicology here in Saint-Étienne. I'm supervised by Laurent Potier, that many of you have met, and by Alain Bonardi from Paris 8. So yeah, my PhD work is in musicological work. So like I'm studying live coding as a performing art, as programming technique, or a plural programming technique, and also as a niche subculture in computer music performance. And so yeah, the idea between, like, my work is all about why live coders do what they do. Are there like technical reasons behind it, political reasons, aesthetical reasons? And so I co-wrote this article with Alex McLean. He's the main developer of one of the most famous live coding library, Tidal Cycles. And he's also a central figure because he founded the algorithm movement with Nick Collins and the Top Lab Collective back in 2004. And so my paper is not about presenting a new tool, a new algorithm. It's not about DSP either. It's just like taking a step back to observe what the software has become, how are musicians using it, and what can we learn about it, basically. And so yeah, observing and taking notes and analyzing it. And it's interesting because we have different backgrounds, and yeah, we are not looking specifically at the same things, and we do not always agree about things. So like, yeah, it's fun. So what about the longest night I'm talking about? The longest night is a live coding event that was organized this winter during the longest night, so December 21. It was, yeah, a big live streamed event worldwide, with many live coders coming from basically all the continents. So we had like an opportunity to observe many different people playing, coming from different scenes, and yeah, and so I need to be fast. So yeah, it's a 3 days non-stop algorithmic music festival. It was organized mostly by the Tidal Cycles community, so there was more people playing with Tidal Cycles than with other live coding languages you may know, like Super Collider, Sonic Pi, Overtone, Orca, or these interfaces. But anyone was allowed to join, so there was like a big range of tools and big range of different visualists, for instance. And we had the opportunity to observe like 113 performances, so it's a lot. We watched everything and we took notes of everything we saw. It was a huge work just to watch the whole thing because it's 3 days of live coded music. So what were our goals? Our goals were to observe how liveness is mediated in live coding performances. So how people do present live coding when they play. Are they live coding from scratch? If they do, why? Are they playing things that they are prepared? Are they shy? Do they like to that people see their system crash or not? Like all these questions, and also like trying to measure what is playing from scratch. What is live coding really? Like, do you have to start and code the DSP algorithms? Can you start with your own libraries? So yeah, again, there is a whole spectrum of things, and we are also interested in new forms of liveness and new forms of from scratch improvisations. So for instance, people playing live coding in a web browser, synchronized on the network, yeah, so these kind of things. And maybe, yeah, so yeah, about the event, as you can see, everything was organized online. And the good thing for me, because I'm a musicologist, is that live coders are archiving stuff themselves. I don't have to do it. They already post everything on archive.org. They already post everything on YouTube. They take notes about how they organize these events. And everything is pretty available online, which is like, a great opportunity. And, so yeah, as you can see, many people coming from, a lot of different places. Obviously, there is more people in Europe and North America, but it's like a wide spectrum. And again. Yeah, so I don't have much time, so let's jump to the conclusions. So we found some interesting things, even for us, because we are already accustomed to live coded music, and we are members of the live coding scene. And we were surprised to see that actually improvisation and studio practices are blended. Like, you can't really decide if people are improvising. You can't tell. It's very blurry and very, there was a whole thing in live coding literature, academic literature, about coding from scratch, and actually we are not sure what it means, because it's very hard to decide what is from scratch, what is not. And also it was presented like some expert, like something that is made for experts and for like very talented programmers, or skilled musicians. It's not at all. Like, many newcomers are playing from scratch, so they live code everything, and it's actually the musicians that are very shy and that they want things to sound good, so they prepare a lot. And so there are interesting things to note about what we saw. And there is already a big literature about liveness in musicology, but I think that there is a need to have new tools and a new vocabulary to talk about what is liveness in the context of live coding performances, because it's you can't talk about it with the tools that were already, like, with the theoretical tools that already exist. And also, like, for Alex, observing an event like this was like observing a research project, so like launching something in nature and see what people do with your project, with your software. So like, it's always useful to do something like this, even if it's like tedious work, just to know like what are the opportunities for like enriching the experience for new musicians, to think about a better interaction with DSP, and that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Next presentation is detection of factors affecting cognitive function in environmental sound. Yasuhiro Kawahara, Hiroshi Oshida, Laurent Potier, and Pierre Marais. Who is presenting? Who is presenting? It's supposed to be Yasuhiro Kawahara? No? Well, so maybe we switch to the next one. Rod Selfridge and Sandra Pauletto. And the title is Sound Design Ideation, Comparing four sound designer approaches.
So hello, my name is Rod Selfridge, and along with Sandra Pauletto, we're presenting a paper called Sound Design Ideation. We're looking at 4 sound designers' approaches to their tasks that we gave them. So the background for this is creating new sounds for sonic interaction design is a sort of non-trivial task. You can get somebody like me, an academic, who makes sound effects, but I don't know whether that's sort of how relevant they are to the objects they're made. When we'd look at professional sound designers and Foley artists who've been doing this thing for years in different genres that are making sound effects that we can sort of live with and not just add to the noise. So the way we did this, we got a set of novel briefs, some new kind of things for them to do, and then look at their initial ideas of how they went about in their processes of trying to create new sounds. So to do this, we sort of created this study. It's in over 4 phases. So the first day, we built rapport with the sound designers and the Foley artists, and then we observed them in their practice in their studios, how they went about their work. And then we gave them sort of 3 briefs on another day, which would sort of designed to challenge them, take them a wee bit away from their comfort zone. Because I didn't want them to just say, I'm going to use wind and rain sound number 16.wav, because that's what I use. We want them kind of more original, more different ideas. So we did an abstract brief, which was sound of a shape moving down the road. What sound would you look at that? A listener in focus, that was more to focus on their listener. So we said, design the sound of a brain. And then for a specific set of listeners, and then we changed the set of listeners and say, well, would that change the sound that you would design for this? And then a more case study one, which is the sound of air pollution, so an air pollution sensor in your jacket or something as you're moving about. And those of you who were here from my earlier talk will notice the link between the two. And then we just did final observations and a follow-up conversation. So quickly on to the results. We noticed that one designer particularly produced sort of more ideas than the rest, and certainly much more than one of the other professional sound designers. And I think that's related to autonomy as well. And then we also did sound of the incremental ideas compared to the shaping ideas. So the shaping ideas is I'm going to do this, the incremental ones, oh, now that I've had this idea, I'm going to build on it, I'm going to add this little bit, and roughly double the amount of incremental ideas to the art of shaping ideas. Then we looked at sort of how they articulate, how the sort of direction their processes take, and we came up with 16 different dimensions, which I won't go through. But we grouped them into 3 categories. So overarching strategy, one of them would be like guidance, whether they wanted to be directed or wanted their sort of their own autonomy. One person who worked in radio was very much, I'll do footsteps, maybe a little bit more, then I'm going to go and ask who's designing the scene or the director, do they want any more, and I'll leave it like that. Another person who worked in sort of film and VR, they were just go, and they never asked for any more guidance whatsoever. And then somebody else who's maybe Sonic Arts, we sort of said, yeah, you can ask whether I was in charge of the animation, can I do this, can I do that? I said, yes, you're free to do all. He then declared himself a vengeful and terrible god, and then went on to create the sounds or discuss the sounds. We didn't look for final sounds, it was sketches, so we could quickly go through them, as many ideas as we could get. The strategy, so the initial focus, do they focus on a scene or do they focus on the specific object that we've talked to them and mentioned in the brief? And then approaches to sound, they use processed sounds, unprocessed, synthesized, natural sounds, that sort of thing. And if you want to know more about it, please come and visit me at my poster and I'll tell you more. Thank you very much.
Okay. So next talk is by Simon Mosen and friends, I would say. Spatial audio mixing in virtual reality.
Hello. Okay, can you hear me well enough? Yeah, okay, cool. So, yeah, hello, my name is Anders. On behalf of my group, including Otto Christensen, Simon Rustami, and Stefania Serafin, I'll be presenting our paper called Spatial Audio Mixing in Virtual Reality. And just for all of us to be aware of what it is I'm talking about, then we here see a virtual environment that is representing audio tracks which are initialized in a DAW separately. We did this to facilitate intuitive interaction due to the multidimensional space and free rotation movement that such a VR system enables. And obviously, spatial audio in VR and spatial audio in DAW individually isn't anything groundbreaking, but we still couldn't find an easy way of introducing these spatial proportions into a workflow that we already knew. Here we see the environment. One can interact with different spheres representing audio sources, solo them, rotate around, and create a spatial mix. We did this with the design motivation of finding a way to intuitively represent sonic interaction and sound in space. Traditionally, one would use a mixing console that represents audio and mixing through the channel strip metaphor using faders and knobs, but obviously this isn't very intuitive in a spatial context, so one can opt to the stage metaphor where we represent it via virtual widgets on a virtual stage, and that is clearly linked to a virtual environment, so that's what we did. The system works the following way. We have a Oculus Quest running a Unity environment. There's different coordinates are then sent into Ableton, where a traditional mix would run. On each track in Ableton, a binaural sound engine implemented in Max MSP is then inserted, and then the binaural spatialization is happening this way. Then in the end, the master bus is just rendered into headphones. More specifically about the binaural engine, we used the positional data to decide on an HRIR from a civic bank, and then that is then loaded and convolved in the frequency domain with our input sound. It's transferred back into time domain using an ISTFT, and then we use again the positional data and the distance data from our virtual environment to apply some volume changes and low-pass filtering to simulate the distance happening in our virtual environment. In order to evaluate it, we carried out a twofold evaluation. First of all, we made a mixing task where we quantitatively evaluated precision and efficiency of mixes. In this case, we invited 24 hobby producers to recreate a mix in our virtual environment and in the same environment, but on a 2D screen. And then secondly, we created a focus group interview with the experts from the Royal Academy of Music in Denmark at the education of sound production and music engineering. Very shortly, the results, first of all, didn't show any significant difference between the two conditions in the mix task. However, we were reported that some of the tracks, or one track specifically, had some dynamic and stereo errors, and when excluding that, we could actually reject the null hypothesis through a t-test in favor of our virtual environment. And then the focus group interview, as we see here, was condensed into a few aspects in terms of efficiency and precision. It was seen as a quick sketching tool, a creative tool, but maybe something that shouldn't be used for precision. Spatial sound algorithm was experienced to be a bit underdimensioned, and the environment was then seen as something abstract that might be able to set the mood for the production and maybe be used as a creative tool in the mixing scenario as well. We have a little demo here we might have time to show. I hope the sound is working. Obviously you won't hear the spatialization on these speakers, but it's just to get an idea. It doesn't work.
Does it sound good?
Oh, yeah, and that was it. Thank you a lot for your attention.
Next speaker is the paper issue on Ubiquitous Archaeology Reconstruction Recent Music by Victor Lazzarini, Damian Keller, and Demajan Hadizovic.
This mic is no good. That mic is better. That mic is better. Yeah. Okay, we'll speak with that mic. So just wait for the slides to come up. By the way, this is a little bit different from what you have seen today. So there is various angles to it. Technology is one of them, but here we are. Okay, so we're three. My colleague Nemanja is here. He'll come in a little later. I'm Victor Lazzarini from Music Department in Maynooth, Ireland. My colleague Damian Keller is all the way in the middle of the Amazon right now, so he can come. And Nemanja is here, who's going to be talking. So our idea here is that we develop some principles based on the archaeology or computer software archaeology into the concept of ubiquitous music archaeology, and pretty much doing something that the cartoon is telling us to do. Instead of we're not doing analog music, but we're doing digital music instead, but trying to recreate the music of great composers such as Jean-Claude Risset, with the original software. We don't have access to the original hardware, but we try to get as close as possible. So ubiquitous music archaeology, or AUBMUS as we say, we try to reconstruct and retrace the ideas that led to the development of various artifacts and music. We have to take consideration of context, material resources, and byproducts that are part of ubiquitous music activities. So we consider ourselves in a part of digital humanities, but there's a strong leaning here towards sound and music computing. So we have a number of cross concerns. For instance, we have to think of the archaeology of creative resources, the archaeology of creative models, and the archaeology of creative ecosystems. So the starting point of this was the recreation of Music 5 under modern operating systems. And we started off with the code that was typed in by Bill Schultz right in the mid-2000s that was great, but was fairly incomplete and with a number of things that weren't quite right, working right. So from that one, we looked back with other resources, such as looking back at Max Matthews' techniques of computer music, which has a great description of the software, and then also looking at code that was in his catalog. And finally, and more recently, then the work that we discovered in the Fond Risset, and that's the work of Nemanja. So we were able then to recreate Music 5 and run it in modern systems. That code then is available at GitHub. You can look at the paper. There is the link there. Everyone can run it if you have a modern operating system. And then we have all the work that was done with the music.
Thank you, Victor. Yes, we were working in Fond Risset that was opened recently. Actually, the whole estate, all the working materials, actually everything that Risset has ever written, basically, also his correspondence, his diaries, everything connected to his professional activities now in Marseille, in Laboratoire Prisme. And that's where we had luck to work with Vincent Tiffon on the digitalization and catalogization of his material. And that's how we actually discovered this original source code for the Music 5 from the 1968. Here you see also an example of a little boy, which is this core code for the little boy. There are a lot of around 300 pages of material connected, only code for this. A lot of sketches and a lot of different annotated material drafts. So what we are basically doing, we are well, actually, maybe it's better that you hear this on our stand. We can play you some of Reset's music from the 1968.
So just to conclude, we have in our stand, we're going to, you can come and have a look and listen to the music. You can also have a look at the software running, and if anyone knows of any other existing source code, either in machine-readable or non-machine-readable format of a version of Music 5, I'll be really interested to hear from you, because we would like to complement, because we know that there are several versions that kind of surfaced in various places, but as far as we know, a lot of them are kind of lost, and we have the only one that's actually running at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lars Bedsen and friends. And the paper is Transformer and LSTM models for automatic counterpoint generation using raw audio.
Hello everyone, we are Lars, Riccardo, and Benedict and Mike, not here, from University of Oslo. And we are presenting an investigation on transformer models compared to LSTM models when applied to raw audio, in particular for a counterpoint generation task. So the generation of harmonic interdependent melodies in order to create a harmonic texture and support a given melody. So if you look at the picture, the figure, we considered songs with 4 voices in total. So the input of our model are a subset of 3 voices, and the output will be a single voice that is not included in the input. We are working with raw audio. This is in MIDI format just for clarity. And the aim was an investigation on the power of transformers model when applied to raw audio in considering a fairly complex task, since no many transformers model example applied to raw audio are existing so far. For the dataset, we start from 5 songs from Bach's work. Each one consisted of 4 voices and 1 minute long. We transcribed in a MIDI format, and then we transpose up and down in order to increase the size of the dataset and have more examples in more keys. This resulted in 60 MIDI files, and then we rendered all possible subset of 3 voices, ending in 900 audio files. We rendered using different instruments.
Yep, and the models we used were, as we said, were LSTM and a transformer model. So the main thing about the transformer model is it has something called attention mechanisms. And we constructed both of these models in a generic encoder-decoder fashion, shown on the right. Where we first rendered the MIDI files to raw audio, and then downsampled from 44 kilohertz to around 3,000 hertz, just because both the LSTM and transformer struggled for very high sampling frequencies. And then we also neglected face information and considered the spectral information to be the most important features to learn. So we then performed STFT to get the spectral images with the window length of 200 milliseconds. And these spectral images is what we use to train our models. Don't know how easy it is to see the results, but basically in terms of accuracy, we trained the models using the MSC loss, and both the LSTM and transformer model performed very well and gave very similar results, proving that the transformer model can be competitive against the current state of the art, which is represented by the LSTM. And looking at the spectral images on the right there, we found that both models were able to capture the main melodies very well. Both struggled a bit with higher frequency harmonics that had a smaller amplitudes. And we also tested both models for an arbitrary sample or an outer distribution sample that was taken from a different composer and a song that wasn't in an original data set. We found similar behavior, that both the models were able to predict the missing voice fairly well, but struggling a bit more with the higher frequency harmonics there. And if you want to listen to any of the samples or have any questions, then come to our poster later. Thank you.
Next speaker is Alejandro Delgado and friends, and the presentation is Deep Embedding for Robust User-Based Amateur Vocal Percussion Transcription.
All right, so I'm Alejandro, and this is work that I've done at Rowley and Queen Mary University of London under the funding of MIP Frontiers, and it's entitled Deep Embeddings for Robust User-Based Amateur Vocal Percussion Classification, which sounds horrendous, but it's actually pretty simple, you'll see. So first off, what is vocal percussion transcription in terms, user-based one? So vocal percussion transcription, you get an input, which is an audio recording of a vocal percussion performance, for example, a beatbox performance, and then you get an output, ideally, which is a drum score of that beatbox performance, for instance, featuring a kick drum, snare drum, hi-hat, close, open, etc. So the challenges of data-driven user-based vocal percussion transcription, data-driven meaning neural network-based, simply, and user-based is individualized models for each user. The challenges is that, well, one of the challenges is that participants usually select the sounds that they want to use to query drum instruments. So for instance, if I were a participant and I chose the ch sound for hi-hat closed and the ch sound for hi-hat open, these sounds are distinguishable, but not that much. So the algorithm could have a hard time distinguishing both, especially when there is no coherence in performance or participants commit some mistakes in performance. End-to-end neural networks trained on individual participants perform best, but they tend to overfit because we don't have enough data. Just a single user would just generate 20 samples of each instrument that they want to trigger. And they're very slow to train, so around 3 minutes per user. So the goal here on a CPU, so the goal here is to find faster data-driven alternatives that do not overfit and are still highly accurate. So we did this. We approached it via feature learning, data-driven feature learning. So we trained a convolutional neural network end-to-end, and we kept the 32 features in the penultimate layer and fed those features into a traditional k-nearest neighbors classifier. So the CNN would act like a dimensionality reduction technique somehow, which would short timings and also, improve, avoid overfitting as a result. So the training of this network was done end-to-end using different classes from different levels of abstraction. For instance, we could use instrument level classes like kick, snare, hi-hat close, hi-hat open, etc. But we could do also syllable level of abstraction, which is lower level. But we can go even lower level of abstraction and do phonemes, like classify individual phonemes and then retain the features there. But also we can do it with sounds. And this is interesting. For instance, the first participant's kick would be a label, or the 13th participant's hi-hat closed would be a label in itself. So it's even the level is reduced. Then we compare it to a timbre set, which was composed of male frequency cepstral coefficients and 4 envelope features, then feature selection routines out of 200 features, and then a GMM HMM method, which was trained in a user agnostic way, meaning that instead of the model focusing on each participant exclusively, they focused on everything, and they tried to classify every sound irrespectively of the participant that it belonged to. So CNN supervised with syllable level ground truth achieved the best and most stable performances, as you can see in the table. User-based approaches achieved significantly higher accuracies than user agnostic baseline, the HMM there, and MFCCs and envelope features perform better than feature selection method. So this was interesting, and we could elaborate in the poster section. So the bottom line is we got faster, non-overfitting, and accurate user-based vocal percussion classifiers via these feature learning methods. And we also got some saliency maps for interpretability of how these classifiers are learning the features, which means which regions of the spectrograms are they focusing their attention when learning the features. And these are interesting results with their focusing of some bandwidth, some regions of not that, where energy is not that present. And yeah, I mean, it's very interesting results here. Thank you very much, and yeah. Pass by.
Next presentation is Franz Zvikovic, and the title is a bit long, a data-driven methodology for considering feasibility and pairwise likelihood in deep learning-based system, guitar tablature transcription system.
I think I win longest title. Yes. So hey everyone, the title of our work is a data-driven methodology for considering feasibility and pairwise likelihood in deep learning-based guitar tablature transcription systems. My name is Frank Switkowitz. So when we're talking about guitar tablature transcription, we're referring to the problem where you're starting with some context window of any spectral features, for instance, the constant Q transform. You're feeding that into some type of differentiable model, for instance, a convolutional neural network. And what you produce is a 6-hot vector. Now, in this case, the 6-hot vector is really 6 1-hot vectors corresponding to the fret classes for each string. So for instance, the silence class, the open string, the first fret, all the way up to whatever amount of frets you're representing. And an example of this type of model is actually also our baseline for this work, and that is tab CNN. So it's basically exactly what I just described, and it's a convolutional neural network. Now what's interesting about tab CNN is the output layer. So they've chosen to formulate this problem as 6 independent softmax classification tasks. And the good thing about this formulation is that it always generates valid predictions because you can only play one fret on each string. So it's impossible to generate invalid predictions. But the problem is that all of these softmax classification tasks work independently of one another. So it's kind of, this formulation is ignoring the high correlation between the fretting of different strings. And this high correlation comes about due to the physical limitations of what you can actually play with your hand, as well as what is musically relevant. So what would you be likely to play musically? So an example I like to give is if you train a system like this poorly, since you can play the same pitch on multiple strings of a guitar, if you get a very high signal for a certain pitch, your model might be inclined to predict it on multiple strings, even though this type of configuration on the guitar is impossible with one hand, and it's not musically likely at all. So the main obstacle for this problem is labeled data. We need audio with transcription labels that also include the strings for each note. So we don't have a lot of that, but what we do have is a lot of symbolic tablature. So tablature, if you don't know, is prescriptive playing notation for guitar or stringed instruments. So this tells you not only what to play, but where to play it on the instrument. And there's a lot of this available online as digital collections. One data set that was just published is called DataGP, and that contains a bunch of this symbolic tablature. So our proposed methodology is to leverage this data to regularize our tablature transcription. So we start by reformulating the output layer, we remove the softmax classification tasks, and we just do binary classification on each string and fret, and that allows us to incorporate an inhibition loss. And the goal of this inhibition loss is to discourage the co-activation of unlikely note pairs. And this inhibition loss is informed by pairwise likelihoods that we estimate from our tablature data. So given a large collection of tablature data, for instance, DataGP, what we do is we go through the entire data set and we compute the frame level intersection over union for every pair of string and frets on the guitar. So basically every note you can play at once. And that gives us this matrix of pairwise likelihoods, which basically says if I choose to put my finger on one string and one fret anywhere on the guitar, what is the likelihood that I would also have my finger on another string and fret anywhere else on the guitar, even including the same string. And there's a lot of very interesting things in here if you want to come and look at the poster. But given these likelihoods, we can construct our inhibition loss. So we take this pairwise likelihood, we take the complement, we raise it to the power B, which is a boosting parameter to relax the amount of inhibition we're doing, and that gives us our inhibition weight for a pair. Now we put this into our inhibition loss, which is summed across all frames and all pairs of string and fret. We multiply the activation produced by the model for each pair with the inhibition weight. So both of the activations by the inhibition weight. And that gives us our loss. So for our experiments, we basically just extend everything that Tab CNN did in their paper, but we replace the output layer with our formulation in the inhibition loss. We run the same 6-fold cross-validation on guitar set, which is our acoustic guitar transcription data set. We evaluate with the same transcription metrics. We do introduce some new metrics to measure how well the distribution of our output predictions match that of the data set that was used to estimate the pairwise likelihoods. And we conduct an ablation study with respect to the inhibition loss. So what we find is that the tablature performance, so the transcription performance, does not increase significantly as a result of this. We think this is really due to the small size of guitar set, that we've kind of already reached a ceiling on this data set, so it's hard to see any improvements. But there also is some label noise in guitar set that's directly at odds with our inhibition objective. But what we do find is the distribution of our predictions more closely matches the distribution of DataGP as opposed to guitar set. And just in summary, we have come up with a method to estimate pairwise likelihoods of different pairs of notes on the guitar using tablature data. We've proposed novel inhibition laws to incorporate these likelihoods, and we've augmented our baseline with this inhibition loss. And all of the code is available online, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Next talk is Patricia Hu and friends. Mooco, a music computing learning application.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patricia Hu, and today I have the pleasure of presenting you to our work on Mooco, a prototype for a music computing learning application. I'm here on behalf of my team and colleagues that you can see on the slides. We are a big team, and yeah, happy to represent them. So our idea for Mooco really started with an old debate that is the one between STEM and the arts and humanities. Traditionally, the arts and the humanities have played only a minor role in STEM education, but recently this purely STEM-focused approach to education has been criticized a lot for lack of diversity and integration, but also for insufficient creativity and interdisciplinarity. This has led to the emergence of a new educational paradigm called STEAM, which is STEM infused with the arts and humanities. STEAM is really based on the concept of creating interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary learning context. This is motivated by several factors. First, it has been shown that adding a creative component can broaden participation in STEM subjects and increase diversity with respect to gender and minorities. It has also been shown that integrating more subjects can help students in making abstract concepts better understandable, which increases student motivation and engagement. And some researchers have also pointed to the potential of STEAM education to engage students in creative and higher order thinking, which are two concepts that are often referred to in the context of 21st century skills. There's also a few downsides to STEAM education, which especially hinder large-scale adoption in formal schooling context. So on the one side, because this is a multidisciplinary approach, there's no shared understanding among researchers and educators when it comes to what exactly is STEAM, and this is especially evident with regards to the role of arts integration. Another obstacle is practical in nature, and this is especially relevant for formal schooling context, and those are issues related to adequate timing and pacing, and also content and discipline alignment, but also on a personal level for effective teacher collaboration. This is where we wanted our prototype to help out. So we have created a prototype called Mooco for music computing, for which our objective is to make programming concepts more accessible to a broader public, while also sparking interest in music and music making. The target user for our prototype is someone who is just starting out learning programming and does not have a lot of knowledge in either programming or music and sound related concepts. To have the prototype be appealing in self-paced and self-directed learning context, our main design rationale was to make it sorry. Okay. Our main design rationale for the application was to make it appealing in self-paced and self-directed learning context, and to this end we included several features, which are the self-contained learning modules. So each learning module is closed in itself and is also clearly structured, where there's always a theory part explaining some sound or music concept, and a code part explaining some computing concept, and then a try-out part where the user is either tested or can try out some of the code concepts himself. Then each of the learning modules are modularly structured. There's always some sort of challenge or knowledge quiz task, and the user has we also have a code editor with a sonification feature, which allows a user to play out his code. Then each learner can collect badges, which can allow them to unlock further modules. And there's also a dashboard which allows the user to look into his overall learning progression. We have done some pilot studies using formative and summative usability formats and got promising results so far. For now, the Mooco application is only a prototype, but we hope to refine it in the future by making it also more appropriate to specific age groups and especially to younger audiences. If you're interested, I would be happy to welcome you at our booth. And if you would want to collaborate, please get in contact with us. And thank you for your attention.
Next presentation is Leonardo Driller and Friends, improving chord prediction in jazz music using melody information.
Hello everyone, my name is Kwan Lon, and along with the rest of the team, we investigated on improving chord prediction in jazz music using melody information. So chord prediction itself is a well-studied task. Usually, the model is given a sequence of chords and also called chord progression. And then if the model predicts the next chord. In our paper, we investigated whether adding melody information such as pitch and duration will help improve the chord prediction accuracy. And to visualize the problem, the goal better this way. This is our baseline model, which is given a sequence of chords, predicts the next one. And the melody model, which is the model that is given the chord progression and the notes, so the melody information, and predicts the next chord. The data set that we use is the Weimar Jazz database. There are 456 jazz solo improvisation. And in there are 418 unique chords. So after inspection, we find that most of those chords are underrepresented in the data set. So we grouped together similar chords and ended up with 183 chords. And here you can see the distribution of the chords after the reduction. And then for more information on how we do the reduction and the encoding, and please come to our poster session. And then onto the model. The architecture of the model is, for both models we use LSTM. And you can see here that the hyperparameters for both of them are very similar, except that the melody model has 2 LSTM layers. And that is expected because the melody model has to retain more information, more data points. And some key results, we find that overall, the melody model improves about half of the tunes in the data set and decrease accuracy for about 38%. And overall, we find after running some statistical tests that it is statistically significant. There is a statistically significant increase of 2.3% across all the tunes in the data set. Then just to conclude, I just want to go over an example, and the example is Ladybird. This example shows that the melody model actually outperforms the baseline model when there is no melody present. As you can see here, there is no melody before the prediction, and we see this as that the melody model is able to encode the fact that no melody is a signal for a very common pattern in music called a turnaround, and is able to notice this and be able to predict the chords accurately, whereas the baseline model does not have this information and would not know that this is a turnaround, therefore predicts incorrectly. So you can see that it's reflected in the accuracy, that the melody model clearly outperforms the baseline. In summary, having melody information significantly improves the accuracy for chord prediction, and especially for cases when there are no melody and for rarer chords. And for the example on rarer chords, please come to our poster and we can show you more about it. Thank you very much.
Next one is Chris Kiefer with Toward Lightweight Architecture for Embedded Machine Learning in Musical Instruments.
Hi, I'm Chris Kiefer from University of Sussex, EMU Lab. So the problem my project is dealing with is how can we run fast inference in restricted computing environments. So we're probably all used to using machine learning in a kind of CPU-hungry, power-hungry, with these sorts of models which have long latencies as well. Maybe there's a case that we sometimes need to look at more lightweight forms of machine learning that we can embed in musical instruments. And so use cases could be, perhaps you've got a feedback instrument where you want to run some sort of battery-powered processor in that's doing very low latency audio processing. Maybe you're interested in ecoacoustics and you want to run machine kind of soundscape analysis on a solar panel in a forest somewhere. So kind of technically this is about getting ML to run on FPGAs and microcontrollers. More philosophically, it's about thinking about what does it mean that machine learning might be seamlessly embedded in an instrument. What is that important for embodiment and musicality? What does it mean if our models aren't tethered to a GPU somewhere? So one potential solution for this, this was published last year at AIMC, is an algorithm called stochastic logic optimization. And this uses a very different network architecture made just of binary logic, two-state logic. And so you don't have to do expensive things like count or do floating point numbers. These run in very low memory, and kind of early results show that you can learn pretty well with these things. And they can run with pretty low latency on a microcontroller. So going beyond these, the paper is about how do you expand this approach to think about signal processing and signal generation. So the networks I've previously looked at are all feed forward. They don't really deal with time, so how do you build time into the model? And how do you represent continuous signals in binary systems? So this is the thing I've been exploring. First of all, signal encoding. I've been using an approach called pulse density modulation, and what this does is takes a continuous signal, passes it through a sort of accumulator, and turns it into a binary signal at a much higher frequency. And then you can then low pass this with some simple analog electronics after a digital pin on your microcontroller to recover the original continuous signal. And thinking about time in Boolean networks, I've been looking, inspired by reservoir computing, looking at random Boolean networks, which are dynamical systems which you can feed a signal into. They have a fading memory of their inputs, and so you get time built into the network. So if you pair these up with a feed-forward network, you can do some learning with time built into the model. I've also been looking at how to grow or create these random Boolean networks. One option is just to make monolithic ones that are randomly connected. A different option is to grow them using a modular hierarchy algorithm, and to think about how they're connected. Do we choose random points to send data in and out of the model, or do we use some different metrics for that? So these are the results of an experiment, which was a sine wave generation task. So it's a pretty simple task. It's good for measuring a model's capacity for time with sine wave generation, because you have to know where you've been to know where you're about to go. And so the results of this, the kind of headline results, are that these models do work for signal generation. So this combination of RBNs and feed-forward logic networks. So you can make sine waves with them, other waveforms as well. And the best performing architectures used RBNs that were generated with a modular hierarchical structure, and with the inputs and outputs selected by looking at betweenness centrality in the network of the RBN. So this is ongoing work. There's still lots of challenges and kind of open questions, really. I'm not sure if these are better than binarized equivalents. So another way to get ML models on a microcontroller is to make a deep network and kind of hack away at it and reduce it accuracy-wise until maybe it's just working in binary. So I haven't done a full comparison yet, and I'm not sure how to do it in a fair way. Still thinking about that. There's some challenges of scaling up, so I'm just kind of getting a feel for how you scale up the complexity in these and just defining what these challenges are. The other thing is getting these running on FPGAs. So the feed-forward network's really fine. You can run them at megahertz. RBN's a little bit more complicated with clocking, so I'm just working on the FPGA implementation of those, and that's it. Thanks.
And we had the presentation that was missing just at the beginning. Yasuhiro Kawahara, Hiroshi Yoshida, Laurent Potier, and Pierre Marais, and the paper is Detection of Factors Affecting Cognitive Function in Environmental Sound.
Good evening. I'm Yasuhiro Kawahara from Open University of Japan. The detection of the environmental sound that affect our daily life makes it possible to access the suitability of the surrounding sound depending on our lives. In this study, we have confirmed pink noise with repeated volume changes effect on human cognitive function by measuring and analyzing the brain waves. And to consider the existence of environmental sounds containing such sound elements that affect human body, an acoustic analysis method was proposed to evaluate the similarity between sounds that affect human body and environmental sounds by using a set of typical environmental sound categories. And similar environmental sound categories were shown in this research. Evaluation of sound that affect cognitive function was done using these three sound sets, repetitive pure tone of 1000 Hz, and repetitive white noise, and repetitive pink noise. Brainwaves of 20 healthy adults, while hearing to these sounds, were measured and analyzed for change in the frequency band power and event-related potentials. Using P50 of EEG event-related potentials and power of PEG alpha-2 waveband power waveband as indicators to assess the brain effects. We considered that repeated pink noise is less likely to be blocked before the primary sensory cortex and reduce deep brain activity. As a method for detecting living environment sound that includes such acoustic elements, pink noise with regularly volume change. We first considered a method for extracting sound that repeatedly change in volume using autocorrelation analysis. This method is developed by preparing 10-second samples of each environmental sound corresponding to the categories indicated in the environmental sound dataset ESC50. This figure illustrates a method for extracting sound that change in volume periodically. In addition to the method described in the previous slide, we analyzed typical environmental sound using the acoustic property index, flatness, and crest, which are characteristic of the repeated pink noise. Several artificial sounds were extracted as environmental sound containing such sounds. Pink colored line. I hope to discuss my further results with you at my poster. Thank you.
So thank you, and sorry again for the delay, latency at the beginning of the talk. We have now like half an hour of the poster session, and we meet again at 4:30 p.m. for the lightning talk session.
moved here. Hopefully it's still okay. Yeah, don't touch it too much.
Last part of the afternoon, Dr. Oded Bental doing a lighting talk, and the name is Music Artificial Intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you. Can someone, if I'm moving too far away and you don't hear me, can someone raise their hand and I'll try to compensate? So I'm going to talk about music artificial intelligence. And the outline of the talk is that I'm going to talk about one example of applying machine learning, some initial insights that we got from doing this project, and then some questions I think we should be asking ourselves, and I want to do it in less than half an hour. So it's a lightning talk. Volker and N project, you can look it up online. It's applying deep learning LSTMs to a kind of Celtic and then some Scandinavian tunes in collaboration with Bob Sturm, who said he's going to be on the video. So hi, Bob, and some other people. And okay, this is, should we know that the basic idea of machine learning is that we can take music, we can digitize it, and then we can feed it to the computer and then output at the other end kind of new music that generated based on this. And it's statistical, so it learns some of the statistical properties of the data and can produce data that kind of echoes that or similar to that. So in our case, Volker and N, the data is what's called session music. So we got about 26,000 tunes in ABC notation, which is a kind of text-based notation. These are just tunes. We didn't study audio, we studied symbolic representation. And in this type of music, it's only melody that it represented, so it's fairly simple. Here's an example. The top is the way it is, ABC notation, and then rendered in music notation. And after we train the model, we can generate new tunes, and they are actually pretty good. Here I can play an example. No, I can't. Because of, what did I do here? So here is this tune. it's a rendition. It's pretty plausible within the style. Of course, I need to do this. And actually, it's even more than plausible. It's actually pretty good. If you do a musical analysis of it, the system learned quite a lot of the kind of conventions with repetition and variation and kind of a first phrase and a second phrase, which is called a tune and a turn. And but then the question is, did it learn music? So the way LSTM works, you can give the system some beginning and ask it to continue. So for example, I gave it this beginning, which is, if you know notation, it's decidedly not Irish. And this is what it got out, which is A, completely unrelated to what I brought in. B, it lost a lot of its supposedly musical learning. It no longer knows how to count bars. It doesn't know anything about correct things. So in other words, the learning is very shallow, it's very fragile, and it's non-human. So we call it machine learning, and we sometimes forget that we assume that the machine learned music the way we learned music, and it definitely didn't. So I think when we talk about music artificial intelligence, we should question both the musical and the intelligence quite significantly before we make any assertions. So some initial observation. You have to be very careful about considering your data. So data is not music. You always have to be aware that there is a gap between the data and the music. And don't assume that just because you see the data and you know this is this music, then that the music is in the data. You need to be more inventive about evaluation, and particularly this kind of what's often called the Turing test, where you present people with human tunes and machine tunes, and they cannot discriminate, and listeners cannot discriminate it, and you say, yay, I won the Turing test. No, you didn't. This is A, this is not a Turing test. B, it makes very little musical sense. And C, it feeds the kind of human versus machine narrative that I think is kind of very dangerous when you're doing AI, when kind of machines are going to take over. And think carefully about music when you're doing it. It's called the data domain of origin. So we apply machine learning to a lot of domains, and we have to kind of look into that domain and think, what is the implication for music? One of the things we did is that we brought in the real experts. So we brought musicians who play this music to record some tunes, and they sound pretty okay. So here. So clearly, as people were bobbing, this version is so much more musical, so much more fun, so much more Irish, and that has nothing to do, of course, with machine learning whatsoever. It has to do with musicians knowing how to play and how to make music and how to select music, right? So this is cherry picking. I thought I started from, because I stopped it. Okay, so this is one way, and we recorded an album full of these, and then we released it into the wild, and we got some people to review it. So this is a comment from one reviewer, and I'll give you a moment to read a little bit. Notice that we treat this as kind of 26,000 tunes of a monolithic kind of tradition, but it's not. There are a lot of nuances and distinctions and knowledge that experts have about this that is both about location, kind of geography and history embedded in it. And unless you talk to these people, you just kind of search for a database online and say, oh, I found a great database. Unless you talk to the people who actually know something about this music, you are missing a lot of stuff and you are kind of avoiding some of the tough questions. That thing that we have been doing for quite a while is creatively poke and prod the system. So I'm a composer primarily, and I'm interested in decidedly non-Irish music, as if you'll be in the concert tomorrow, you'll hear. And I've been working with the system to produce music that is kind of interesting, but not quite me, not quite Irish. And we got other people. So Bob composed or took some music out of this and arranged it and composed with it. We invited other performers, improvisers, composers to work with the system, and you start realizing what its musical potential and what its musical problems are. So this was part one. Now on to the where we might be heading, and I want to go back to two nice French geniuses. So this is a famous quote from Edgar Varèse about the potential of new music or electronic music. This is I think 100 years ago, 1921, and I think we are still, it is a partly realized potential of this in computer music or electronic music. We made a lot of kind of new things, new possibilities, but to a degree that they're kind of totally innovative and original is, yeah, maybe not. And one of the things to question is how much, AI is kind of the new big thing in music. How much is it going to go this route? And I want to contrast it or with another French guy. Eric Satie's furniture music. If you don't know, listen to it, it's fantastic. Music that is intended to be heard and not listened to. The sonic equivalent of curtain, sofa, or coffee table. And I think this is where AI is currently doing quite well. Or will be doing very quickly, doing things. It will kind of generating music that is kind of background, not very interesting, but kind of pleasant, is something that AI is probably currently doing or very close to. I think this is kind of the real challenge when we think about music AI, and I'll read this. Listeners can be considered as adaptive epistemic systems that determine the semantic relationship with their external world through processes of selection and elimination, and by giving semantical weight to these distinctions. And I think this is important when, when we think about AI, because a lot of the discussions around AI and what it's going to be assume a kind of fixed human creativity. You know that we can now create hits, supposedly, or in 5 years we'll be able to create, today's hits with AI. And it's meaningless to, I mean, you can probably, maybe you'll be able to do it, but then as the technology develops, our perception of what is musically desirable, what we want to hear, what is creatively possible and thing also change. So we have to really remember that it's a kind of interaction, dynamic system between the listener and the music. And this is often lost in a lot of stuff. And partly as a result of kind of all this story, we established this research network, data sounds, data sets, and data sense. My colleague Federico is responsible for that wonderful name. And we started in January. I'm leading the network. And we are kind of trying to, or contribute to the kind of question that need to be asked. So identify core question that will drive forward the next phase in data-rich music research. And we are deliberately not going just on AI. Data and music can have a lot of other things related to it. And We started the monthly virtual seminars. The last one is going to be at the end of this month. It's last Monday of the month. We will resume in September, hopefully, once I get my act together. We did the first workshop in April. We're going to do another one in Stockholm in November. And there will be other stuff, so a grant writing workshop and some additional activities. You can go to the website and get in touch if you want to hear updates, of course. And since our aim is to talk about questions we should be asking, I'm going to throw in some of these, or not exactly some questions, but some initial, we still have a year to figure out this. So these are kind of initial sketches. One, I think, is about ownership. So when we talk about an AI, there's a lot of question about who owns and copyright and stuff, but I think it's not the only question that matters about ownership. It's also about achievement. So that I think important thing about music is not just who owns the legal rights, but the sense that you made something that is you, that only you could make, a sense of achievement. And I think this is missing from a lot of discussions and a lot of systems that are designed to kind of give, that people, users can generate music in 3 clicks of a button. And but these systems have their uses, but describing them as composition systems, I would very much challenge that. I mean, it's just the same as taking a frozen meal out of the freezer into the microwave. It's functional, it gets you fed. I wouldn't call it cooking. So I think we need to think about that too, and especially systems that help users realize personal ideas, and how do you kind of guide people with less knowledge in that, so ownership. The other one is expertise. And here, there are kind of strange echoes to Andrew McPherson's talk in this one, I think, in the next one. So musicians developed, kind of accumulated quite a lot of knowledge in the last, 500 years or more. And we need to tap that knowledge more. If you go into doing some music AI, don't assume that you know everything about music just because you have a music degree, right? You know something about music, great, but there are a lot of kind of things you don't know, and we should invite more people who are not technologically minded to be part of the conversations. And I think that one of the contributors to the workshop we did in April pointed out the slow development. So most of the music technology until 50 years ago benefited from very slow development, right? The violin developed over 100 years, the piano, depending when you start, even kind of similar. And until they got to the point where they're really useful musical instruments, took time. And when you are constantly just hopping on the next, you did LSTM, now you do convolutional neural network, now you do adversarial, and you kind of jump and jump and jump, you don't have the opportunity to refine, to develop, to do something that is musically more engaging. And that's one of the kind of challenges. How do we make tools that also encourage their users to develop expertise, which relate to this kind of ownership thing? And I think is the imagination. A lot of the current work is essentially replicating existing modes of music making and musical style, right? Style emulation is a lot of the current work. And also, doing what we currently do, maybe kind of manipulating a lot of sound files in your computer, how we can do it more effectively, efficiently, which is fine, which is good to do. But we can also think about, okay, this technology has potential to do things that we currently can't. And instead of kind of doing, how do we replace what we currently do, how do we invent new things? And I think a good example of that is turntabling, right? So the turntable was designed to do one thing, and then people figured out that it can do other things and started becoming creative with it. But again, this took time and kind of an opening for people to actually do that. how do we imagine new AI music, and develop the user's capability to imagine music through new tools. Because eventually, kind of the user's imagination is the kind of most crucial musical, attribute that we need. I think I went really fast, right? So these are some publications if you want to follow those or read up. So if you want to hear some of the more technical details, look it up. And thank you for your time. I was leaving time for questions, but I don't know if it will work or not. If anyone wants to answer some questions. Total silence. So, as I tell my students, either I'm brilliant or I'm completely incomprehensible. Okay, we can talk about.
Yeah, we can continue the discussion on this
Outside.
part outside, because you can still follow the poster session until 6 p.m. if you want to go to the Le Corbusier Church, because we have buses, 3 buses taking us to the place. So you can just stay here if you want, and then we.
If you want, there is someone who dared ask a question.
Hello, Philippe Pasquier from Simon Fraser University. Thanks for the talk. That was the shortest keynote I ever heard. I loved it. My question has to do with maybe linking your talk with the keynote we had this morning. And if I understand correctly, Folk-RNN is more of a purely generative system where you give the input and it generates the track for you. In computer-assisted composition, a lot of systems are more interactive, with back and forth between a composer and the system. And so I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about what would be the implication of not only the algorithm and the music AI per se, but the design around it and the interaction and the interface of those algorithms on the sense of authorship, for example, of someone using those algorithms, or on the listeners of the final results.
So Folk-RNN is, you can work with Folk-RNN interactively the way I do. So the way I composed this music I composed with Folk-RNN was, you do have some controls over the generation process. So as I showed, you can simply give it a few notes to begin with and it can continue. You have some other few parameters. And the way I worked, which is admittedly tedious, is to generate it, to initiate with some parameters, look at the result, see how bad it is, drop it, do again and again and again and again, until I found some things that I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I keep it to the side. And through this process, so one thing that is both interesting and frustrating about these kind of AI systems is that they are nonlinear. Right? So you change something at the input end and you don't know exactly what the output will be, which is why they are kind of able to produce interesting results. But it also means that if you want to navigate the system and say, okay, I like this bit, but I want to move over there, you can't. But kind of this, for me, this iterative process of trial and error, you gradually get to say, okay, if I change this, something happens over there. And that's the way I use it. So it is interactive, but it's not interactive. It's kind of maybe interactive in the way that really old computer music was, that you had your pack of punch cards and you went to the machine and you gave the machine this and then you went home for 3 days and you got back, right? And you need patience to do that, and we don't no longer have this patience. So I think systems that do allow you some interaction and kind of improve that interaction. And Bob and I have been talking a little bit about how things, for example, you have a basic model and then it learns what you prefer and starts giving you more of what you prefer and less of what you don't prefer. That thing that Bob has been doing, which needs to happen more is to investigate how the system learned, or the inside of the network. And then you can start figuring out, okay, if I can put a lever here, I can give the user more direct control. Now, the final part of the answer to this is that I don't think there is only one use case, right? So there'll be different use cases for AI, and the kind of the design of a good AI system will have to match the use case and the workflow. So, for example, the workflow of a TV show, music for a TV show, is completely different than my workflow as a composer, than the workflow of a kind of studio-based artist that records an album. And we need to kind of work with these people, in a sense, bring them in to the conversation of, give them an ability to work with the system and discover what its potential by kind of back and forth and refining the system and improving it. That has to go beyond, the system works as good as human, that's fine, let's move to the next system. Do we want any other?
Any question?
Hi, yeah. Earlier today, Gewang was mentioning about this, how something, or in what way something becomes a tool and becomes an instrument or a toy. So when I was thinking with what you were just saying, I was thinking it for this, the same thing for AI-based instruments or tools we have. Because first of all, how we define a good AI system, if it answers our expectations. So it implies that we usually have some predefined expectations, like it needs to sound good, it needs to be accurate somehow. But when I think from this toy perspective, I just want to ask, and not only to you, but like it's an ongoing discussion, how AI can be more playful. And when I ask this to myself, I think about how kids interact with toys. Usually, kids don't have a predefined intention when they start interacting with toys, right? They start learning to move with toys, and toys teach them something. So it's an embodied process. And so if I summarize what I want to ask is, we're always trying to teach the machine something, but what machine can teach us? So that's actually my question.
I'll answer in a kind of strange, my own strange way. I disagree with the premise that a good AI is a good AI is a good system that meets our expectations. I think a good AI is one that, for example, encourages to be more imaginative and to change our expectations, to learn how to translate, how to imagine more things, and how to translate from our imagination to some realization of that, for example. And also a good AI is the one that encourage sufficient time, that is rewarding to invest the time in it to develop expertise, and that you can kind of start in as a novice user and become an expert at making music with this tool. But again, entirely possible, or even likely, that some AI will kind of be designed in a kind of simple and much more playful way, or kind of even at the simplest level, the AI that generates kind of tunes for elevator music and supermarket music. These don't need to be highly creative or stuff. They just need to kind of generate income, right? So I think there isn't one thing in there. But we need to kind of think about what musicians need, and then invite them, or what particularly musicians who are really kind of not stuck in a route of this is what I do, but musicians who are more versatile and more open to new ideas, and to give them tools that they can manipulate and try and come back to us, if it could do this, it'll be wonderful, right? And I think that's a better way, or a kind of more inventive and creative way to develop this field. Thanks. You had a question? Or?
Hello, thank you for the talk. So you mentioned kind of just now profits and how AI serves a great purpose of like generating music that doesn't necessarily challenge or intrigue us, but that, you know, serves a purpose and generates money. But as AI improves and as kind of our understanding of music generation improves, how confident are you, or how are you confident that artists will still have space to create and to, well, earn a living in the end of the day within the next 10, 20 years? For example, so a couple of years ago, there was an investigative piece that came out where a lot of artists on Spotify who had millions and millions of listeners per month making, you know, ambient music or like simple house music, had absolutely no presence outside of Spotify, and were found to basically not exist as people. And so a lot of people suspect that Spotify is starting to invest in like generative music to not have to pay artists. Is this a trend you see kind of burgeoning, or do you feel like artists will still have space to create and earn income? And how can we maybe curb something like this from happening with the intention of, you know, profit generation and hurting artists?
Okay, so in the last seminar in the virtual data, someone mentioned this Spotify story, and it turns out that these are not artificial artists. These are actual people who found a niche to make a living making essentially furniture music, like Satie intended it in a way. And they simply were very productive, and there are all sorts of ways in which artists are manipulating or adapting their work to the kind of constraints of Spotify environment in many ways. You can watch the seminar when we put the video up, which we do eventually. But as the talk mentioned, one thing is that what we call artists is maybe changing, right? We assume that if someone is only on Spotify and makes music for Spotify, they're not an artist because they don't perform, but maybe we need to change what we mean by artist, right? That's part of the answer. I think a kind of two other things where I think I'm touching this, where I see AI really conquering is again this kind of low-hanging fruit of music that is kind of background music. I think that's totally conquerable for AI, not in the too distant future. But as I said, I think, okay, I'll give another example. 15 years ago, Apple came up with these Apple loops, which is kind of canned music that you can stick in. And the idea was that everybody can kind of put together these and they sound good, they're kind of good music. But very quickly, even though it was a vast database of Apple loops, musicians learned to identify, oh, this guy is using, the kind of producers, the record label and stuff, this guy is using Apple loops. So even though you had the tool, we adapted our listening to realize that, okay, this is canned music, I don't want it. AI is predicting about the future is always dangerous, and AI is a powerful tool. But I truly trust, on the one hand, the kind of creativity inherent in people, that people will learn how to use AI creatively and invent new ways of making music through AI. I do think on the kind of artist income side, well, I don't make my income as an artist, right? I make it as a lecturer. And I think not a lot of artists make a lot of music out of music making. So it has always been tough. and it will continue to be tough. Whether it'll be more tough, who knows? And you know, World War III might be more of a challenge than AI. But I do think that the skills that musicians need, some of them will need to be different, right? I mean, some of the basic skills are simply listening and imagining and discerning and kind of be critical about what you listen. I think that doesn't matter what tool you make. As long as you make music for humans, you need to have that. But in other ways, some of the tool training that we give artists now, we need to kind of augment them or supplement them or replace some of them or kind of change alter them to make them a bit more viable. I think that's good for, and let people enjoy the things. Thank you.